The park bench where James Sullivan ate lunch every Tuesday had become his refuge, a quiet spot under a massive oak tree in Portland's Laurelhurst Park, where he could watch his 7-year-old son Henry play for exactly 45 minutes before the afternoon construction shift started. The brown paper bag in his hands held the same thing it always did, a peanut butter sandwich he'd made at 5:30 that morning, an apple he'd bought bruised and discounted from the corner market, and a juice box he'd convinced himself was a luxury they could still afford. It wasn't much, but it was his. And after 18 months of scraping by as a single father working 2 jobs, James had learned to protect the little he had with the fierce desperation of a man who knew exactly how far the fall was, from barely making it to losing everything. But watching the little girl across the playground changed something fundamental in that carefully constructed survival instinct. She couldn't have been more than 6, small and painfully thin, wearing a pink jacket that had seen better years and shoes held together with what looked like duct tape. She sat alone on the swing, not swinging, just sitting with her hands folded in her lap, watching the other children with an expression James recognized instantly because he'd seen it in his own mirror during the worst months after his wife Michelle's hunger, not just for food, though that was part of it, but for normalcy, for the kind of childhood where you ran and played instead of sitting still, conserving energy because there wasn't enough fuel in your body to waste on joy. If you've ever had to choose between your own need and someone else's suffering, stay with us. This story will show you what happens when passion wins. Henry ran over, his cheeks flushed from running, his eyes bright with the kind of energy James envied. "Dad, can I have my sandwich now? I'm starving." James pulled out the lunch, but his eyes kept drifting to the girl on the swing. She was watching them now, not obviously, but with the careful peripheral vision of a child who'd learned that staring attracted attention you didn't want. "Hey buddy," James said slowly, an idea forming that his practical mind immediately tried to shut down. "You see that girl over there, on the swing?" Henry followed his gaze and nodded. "She looks sad, Dad." That simple observation from his son hit James like a physical blow. Michelle would have already been over there, offering help with that warm smile that made strangers trust her instantly. She'd never been able to walk past suffering without stopping, even when they had their own problems, even when James had worried they couldn't afford her generosity. "We give what we can, James," she'd say in that voice he still heard sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, "because someday, we might be the ones who need someone to see us." James stood up, his heart pounding with that particular anxiety that came from doing something that felt right and terrifying simultaneously. "Come on, Henry. Let's go say hello." They walked across the playground, and as they got closer, James noticed details that made his chest tighten. The girl's jacket was clean despite its age, her hair carefully braided, her face scrubbed. Someone was trying, really trying, to maintain dignity against impossible odds. An older woman, maybe 70, sat on a bench 50 feet away, watching the girl with an expression that mixed fierce love with devastating helplessness. "Hi there," James said gently, crouching down to the girl's eye level. "I'm James, and this is my son Henry. What's your name?" The girl looked at him with enormous brown eyes that held too much wariness for someone so young. "Maya," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James smiled, keeping his body language open, non-threatening. "That's a beautiful... Listen, Maya, Henry and I packed way too much lunch today. Like, embarrassingly too much. We were wondering if maybe you'd help us eat some of it. We hate wasting food." It was a lie, of course. A transparent one. But it was a lie that offered dignity, that let this child accept help without admitting need. And James had learned from Michelle that sometimes kindness required small deceptions. Maya's eyes flickered to the older woman on the bench, seeking permission. The woman's face was carefully neutral, but she nodded slightly, and something in that small gesture told James she understood what he was offering. Henry, bless him, caught on immediately. He sat down on the swing next to Maya and pulled out the sandwich, breaking it carefully in half. "I like peanut butter, but Mom always made way too much. Do you like peanut butter?" Maya nodded, and when Henry handed her half the sandwich, she took it with trembling hands and ate with the kind of controlled desperation that broke James's heart. Not fast, not grabbing, but steady, methodical, making each bite last because she didn't know when the next meal would. James gave her the apple and the juice box, watching her face light up like he'd handed her treasure. The older woman approached slowly, her shoulders squared with pride, fighting a losing battle against gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, her voice carrying the accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, maybe Spanish or Portuguese. James stood, meeting her eyes. "I know, but I wanted to. No kid should be hungry in park on a beautiful day." The woman studied him for a long moment, and James had the strange sensation of being measured against some invisible standard. Whatever she saw must have satisfied something, because her rigid posture softened slightly. "Thank you," she said simply. Things have been difficult." James nodded, understanding flooding through him. "I get it, more than you know. Been there myself." He pulled out his wallet, knowing even as he did it that he was about to make his own week significantly harder, and handed her a $20 bill. "Please, get her something warm for dinner." The woman's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I can't." But James closed her fingers around the money gently. "Yes, you can. Someone helped me once when I needed it. This is me paying that forward." He scribbled his phone number on a scrap of paper from his pocket. "If things get really tight, call me. I don't have much, but I know resources, places that help. Families. You don't have to do this alone." As James and Henry walked away, his son was quiet for several steps before speaking. "We're going to be extra hungry this week, aren't we?" James ruffled his hair, his throat tight. "Maybe a little, but we'll be okay. We've got each other, and we've got our health. That little girl and her grandma needed help more than we need an extra sandwich." Henry nodded solemnly, processing this in the way children do. Mom would have done the same thing. James blinked hard against sudden tears. "Yeah, buddy. She definitely would have." He had no idea, walking away from that park bench, that he'd just set in motion a series of events that would transform both their lives in ways he couldn't have imagined. All he knew was that he'd chosen compassion over self-preservation. And whatever the cost, it was worth it to honor Michelle's memory and teach his son that being broke didn't mean you had to be broken. 3 weeks passed, and James mostly forgot about the encounter in the park. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because his life was a relentless treadmill of survival that left little room for reflection. Wake at 5 a.m., make breakfast and Henry's lunch, drop him at before school care by 6:30, work construction until 3 p.m., race to pick up Henry, work his evening shift doing freelance carpentry repairs until 9, collapse into bed, and do it all again. The $20 he'd given away meant they ate a lot of rice and beans that week, but they made it work. They always did. The knock on his apartment door came on a Thursday evening, just as James was heating up leftover spaghetti for dinner. He wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody visited their small 2-bedroom place in southeast Portland, except occasionally his sister Rachel, and she always texted first. Through the peephole, James saw an older couple, well-dressed, standing with the careful posture of people not accustomed to visiting neighborhoods like his. The man was maybe 75, silver-haired and wearing a suit that probably cost more than James made in a month. The woman beside him was the one from the park, Maya's grandmother. James opened the door, confused and suddenly anxious. "Can I help you?" The man extended his hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Mr. Sullivan, James Sullivan, my name is Robert Martinez, and this is my wife, Elena. I believe you met our granddaughter Maya a few weeks ago." His voice carried the authority of someone used to being listened to, but his eyes were warm, even humble. "May we come in? We'd like to talk with you." James stood aside, acutely aware of his apartment's shabby furniture and peeling paint, the thrift store decorations and patched carpet. Henry was at the kitchen table doing homework, and he looked up with wide, curious eyes as the well-dressed strangers. "Henry, why don't you go watch TV in your room?" James and his son gathered his books without argument, sensing adult business. Once they were seated, Robert and Elena on the worn couch, James on the chair with the broken spring he'd learned to avoid, an uncomfortable silence stretched. Elena spoke first, her eyes glistening. "Mr. Sullivan, James, we need to thank you properly for what you did at the park. Maya talked about you for days, about the kind man who shared his lunch and didn't make her feel ashamed." Her voice cracked slightly. "You have no idea what that meant to her, to us." James shook his head, uncomfortable with gratitude that felt too large for what he'd done. "It was just a sandwich. Anyone would have—" But Robert interrupted gently. "No, most people wouldn't have. Most people looked right past her, right past us. You saw her. You saw that she mattered." He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Let me explain our situation. 3 months ago, my daughter, Maya's mother, died in a car accident. Sudden, devastating. Maya's father had never been in the picture. We took her in immediately, but the timing, it complicated things." Elena picked up the thread, her accent more pronounced now with emotion. "We just retired and moved most of our assets into a trust that takes 60 days to fully transfer. We have millions of dollars on paper, but for 2 months, we were living on Social Security and the small amount of accessible cash we'd kept for the transition. We thought it would be simple. We thought we had everything planned." She laughed, bitterly. "We didn't plan for our daughter to die. We didn't plan to suddenly be raising a traumatized 6-year-old on $800 a month while lawyers sorted through probate and trust documents." James felt his worldview tilting. "You're wealthy?" It seemed impossible. Everything about that day in the park had screamed poverty. The worn clothes, the hungry child, the desperation he'd recognized. Robert nodded. "We are now." The trust cleared last week, but for those 2 months, we learned what it means to be truly poor, the humiliation of food banks, the impossible math of choosing between utilities and groceries, the way people look through you when you can't afford what they sell. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. You gave us $20 when you clearly didn't have $20 to spare. You gave my granddaughter dignity and kindness when the world had been cruel. We want to repay that. She tried to hand the envelope to James, but he raised his hands, refusing it instinctively. I don't want money. I'm glad I could help, but I don't need repayment. Robert smiled, and there was something knowing in. James, we've learned a bit about you over the past few weeks. I hope you'll forgive us. We hired someone to find out who you were. We know about your wife's death 2 years ago. We know about the medical debt you're still paying off. We know you work 70 hours a week trying to provide for your son. James felt a flash of anger mixed with violation. You investigated me? We did, Robert admitted without apology. Because when someone shows extraordinary kindness, we wanted to understand what motivated, and what we found was a man drowning, but still reaching out to save others. That's rare, James. That's precious. He gestured to the envelope Elena still held. That contains a check for $50,000. Before you refuse, let me explain what it really is. It's not charity. It's an investment. James stared at them, his heart pounding. $50,000. It was impossible. It was too much. It was... Elena spoke again, her voice firm now, brooking no argument. We run a foundation, James. The Martinez Family Foundation. We fund educational programs, small business development, community initiatives. But we've realized we need someone on the ground, someone who understands what struggle looks like, to help us identify where our money can do the most good. We're offering you a job, $45,000 a year, full benefits, flexible hours, so you can be present for Henry. Your role would be community outreach, finding families like yours, like ours was temporarily, and connecting them to resources. The room spun. James gripped the arms of his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. I don't have a degree. I'm a carpenter. I don't know anything about foundations or nonprofits. Robert leaned back, his expression gentle. You know the most important thing. You know what it means to need help and how hard it is to ask for it. You know how to see people the world ignores. That can't be taught, James. That's earned through pain and still choosing compassion. Elena set the envelope on the coffee table between them. The $50,000 is a signing bonus to clear your debts and give you breathing room. The job starts whenever you're ready. We have an office in downtown Portland, but most of the work would be in the community, talking to people, building relationships, identifying need. She smiled, and it transformed her face. Maya told us you have a kind voice. She said you made her feel like she wasn't invisible. That's the qualification that matters. James couldn't speak, couldn't think. This didn't happen. People like him didn't get rescued by miracles disguised as elderly couples with foundation money. But Henry's voice came from the hallway. He'd obviously been listening. Rules about privacy forgotten in the face of life-changing conversation. Dad, say yes. Please say yes. You're always so tired. The simple plea from his son broke through James's shock. He looked at Robert and Elena, these strangers who'd somehow seen worth in one small act of kindness, and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 2 years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of wishing things were different, but the solid, real hope of possibility actually would reach. I don't know what to say, James whispered. Elena stood, walked over, and took his hands in hers. Say you'll let us help you the way you helped us. Say you'll trust that sometimes the universe pays attention when we choose love over fear. Say yes, James. He looked down at their joined hands, hers soft and manicured, his calloused and scarred from construction work, and saw not difference, connection. Yes, he said, his voice breaking. Yes, thank you. Yes. The first month working for the Martinez Family Foundation felt like James had stepped into an alternate reality where his exhaustion wasn't a permanent state of being. The office in downtown Portland was beautiful. Exposed brick, large windows overlooking the Willamette River, a kitchen stocked with coffee and snacks employees could take freely. But more than the physical space, it was the respect that disoriented. People listened when he spoke. His opinions about which programs to fund, which communities needed attention, which approaches actually worked versus which looked good on paper, they mattered. They shaped decisions involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. Robert had introduced him to the small team with genuine warmth. This is James Sullivan, our new director of community outreach. He brings something we've been missing, real understanding of the people we serve. Listen to him, learn from him. Miguel, who managed grants, had shaken his hand without the subtle condescension James had come to expect from educated professionals encountering construction work. Welcome aboard. We need your perspective badly. Too many foundations are run by people who've never struggled. We end up funding what we think people need instead of what they actually need. James's first assignment was to identify 5 families in Portland who were on the edge, working hard, doing everything right, but one emergency away from catastrophe. Find them, Elena had instructed during his orientation. Tell them we want to help, not with conditions or bureaucracy, just real immediate support. Then report back on what you learned about how we can do this better. So James went back to the places he knew intimately. The neighborhoods where rent consumed 70% of income, where parents worked multiple jobs and still qualified for food assistance, where kids wore coats in summer because they were thin enough to need layers year-round. He talked to the woman who served him coffee at the diner where he used to eat on paydays, learning she was raising 3 grandchildren on a waitress's wages. He met the single mom at Henry's school, who volunteered despite working, discovering she was one missed paycheck from losing her apartment. He connected with the veteran who did odd jobs around the neighborhood, finding out he'd been sleeping in his car for 6 months. Each conversation was hard. People who struggled had learned to hide it, to maintain pride even when asking for help felt like admitting failure. But James had a gift for making them feel seen rather than judged. "I've been where you are," he'd say simply. "2 years ago, I was choosing between electricity and groceries. I'm not here to fix you. You're not broken. I'm here to offer a hand up while you're climbing." The reports he wrote for Robert and Elena weren't clinical non-profit language about stakeholders and impact metrics. They were stories, real, human stories, about people working themselves to exhaustion, about children who'd learned to say, "I'm not hungry," to spare their parents' guilt, about the impossible math of poverty where every solution created 2 new problems. "We can't just give money," he wrote after his first week. "We need wraparound support, childcare so single parents can work better hours, car repairs so they can get to those jobs, mental health services because poverty is traumatic and trauma makes escaping poverty harder." Elena read his reports with tears in her eyes. This is what we need, not sanitized data, but truth. They began reshaping foundation priorities. Based on James's insights, funding programs he identified as actually helpful versus merely well-intentioned. A small grant to the diner where the grandmother worked, allowing her boss to offer health insurance to long-term employees. Scholarship money with realistic living expenses built in, not just tuition. A partnership with a local auto shop to provide sliding-scale repairs for working families. But the transformation in James's personal life was equally profound. For the first time since Michelle's death, he could breathe. The $50,000 signing bonus had cleared the medical debt that had crushed him for 2 years, paid off the high-interest credit cards he'd been juggling, and left enough to create a small emergency fund, the kind of financial cushion he'd never had. His new salary meant he could work 1 job instead of 2, be home for dinner with Henry, help with homework without nodding off from exhaustion. Henry noticed the change immediately. "Dad, you smile now," he said one evening while they were cooking. Actual cook, not just reheating whatever was cheapest. Like real smiles, not the tired ones. James pulled his son into a hug, overwhelmed by how close he'd come to losing this, not just financially, but emotionally. He'd been so consumed by survival that he'd been disappearing piece by piece, becoming a ghost in his own life. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into the job, James brought Henry to the office. He'd arranged a surprise. Maya and her grandparents were visiting Portland, and Elena had suggested the children meet properly. When Maya walked in holding Elena's hand, her transformation was as dramatic as James's own. She was healthy, her cheeks fuller, her eyes bright, wearing clothes that fit, and shoes that weren't held together with hope and duct tape. But more than the physical changes, she carried herself differently. Head up, shoulders back, the posture of a child who knew she was loved and secure. Maya recognized James immediately and ran to him, hugging his legs fiercely. "You're the sandwich man!" She looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes. "Abuela says you're an angel." James crouched down, his throat tight. "No, sweetie, just someone who had a sandwich to share." But Maya shook her head with the certainty children possess. Angels share sandwiches. That's what makes them angels. The children played in the office's small break room while the adults talked, Henry showing Maya his drawings, their laughter drifting down the hall like music. Robert watched them with an expression James had learned to recognize. Gratitude mixed with grief for the daughter who should have been there watching her child thrive. "You gave us hope when we had none," Robert said quietly. "Not just the food, though Maya talks about that sandwich like it was a feast. You gave us dignity. You saw us as people worth helping, not problems to be solved." James shook his head, still uncomfortable with praise that felt outsized. "I just did what anyone should do." But Elena was firm. "Most people don't. That's the problem. Most people are so focused on their own survival that they can't see others struggling right beside them. You were barely surviving yourself, and you still looked up. You still saw. That's heroism, James. The visit ended with promises to stay in touch, with Maya making Henry promise to video chat with her, with hugs that felt like family rather than professional connections. After they left, James sat at his desk overlooking the river and thought about the strange mathematics of generosity. He'd given away a sandwich and $20 he couldn't afford, and in return, he'd received not just financial stability, but purpose, community, and the knowledge that Michelle would be proud of the man he, despite everything trying to break him. Miguel knocked on his doorframe. Got a minute? James waved him in, and Miguel sat, his expression serious. I wanted you to know something. Before you came, this foundation was good but safe. We funded established programs, checked boxes, made wealthy donors feel like they were helping. But you've changed how we operate. We're taking risks now, trusting people, getting our hands dirty. It's messy and harder to quantify, but it's real. You're making us better at our own mission. That night, putting Henry to bed in their apartment, still small, still modest, but no longer a source of anxiety, James thought about trajectories. How one moment of choosing compassion over self-preservation had altered the entire course of his life. How easily he could have walked past Maya that protected his meager lunch, stayed invisible in his own struggle. But Michelle's voice had guided him, and Henry's innate kindness had reminded him that character was defined by what you did when you had every excuse not to. Dad? Henry's sleepy voice came. Are we going to be okay? Like, really okay? James smoothed his son's hair, remembering all the nights he'd wondered the same thing, terrified of the answer. Yeah, buddy, we really are. 6 months into his role at the Martinez Foundation, James had become unexpectedly good at his job, developing a reputation within Portland's nonprofit community as the guy who actually understood poverty rather than theorizing about it. Other foundations started calling, asking his advice on program design. Local news did a feature on the foundation's new approach, interviewing James about dignity-centered philanthropy. The attention made him uncomfortable, but Robert was insistent. Your story matters, James. Not for ego, but because people need to see that small acts of kindness can create massive ripple effects. The ripples were indeed spreading in ways James was only beginning to understand. The grandmother he'd helped at the diner, Maria, was now managing the establishment after the owner received foundation support to expand and promote from within. The single mom from Henry's school had completed a nursing program funded by a foundation scholarship designed with James's input to include rent assistance and childcare. The veteran living in his car was now housed and working as a peer counselor for other veterans experiencing homelessness, employed by a program the foundation had expanded based on James's recommendation. But the most unexpected development came when Elena called James into her office one Tuesday morning with unusual formality. Robert was there too, and both wore expressions James couldn't quite read, serious, but with an underlying excitement. Sit down, James, Elena said gently. We have a proposal we'd like you to consider. James sat, his mind racing through possibility. Had he done something wrong? Was the foundation changing direction? Elena continued. We've been watching how you work, the relationships you build, the way communities respond to you. You have a gift for this, for seeing people, for connecting resources to real need, for maintaining dignity in the process. She exchanged a glance with Robert. We're getting older. We're 76 and 78. We won't be able to run this foundation forever. We need to think about succession. The implication took a moment to land. When it did, James's first instinct was to refuse. You want me to take over? I've been here 6 months. I don't have nonprofit management experience. I barely... Robert interrupted with a raised hand. We're not talking about tomorrow, James. We're talking about a 5-year plan. We'd like to promote you to associate director immediately, with the understanding that you'll gradually take on more leadership responsibilities. We'll mentor you, teach you the financial and legal aspects, introduce you to our network. By the time you're fully in charge, you'll be ready. Elena leaned forward. When Robert and I started this foundation 40 years ago, we had money and good intentions. That's it. We learned everything else by doing it, by making mistakes, by listening to people smarter than us. You have something we never had at the beginning. You've lived the life of the people we serve. That perspective is invaluable and increasingly rare, and most foundation directors come from wealth. They're smart and well-meaning, but they've never had to choose between medicine and food. You have. That makes you uniquely qualified to lead with both compassion and wisdom. James felt the weight of what they were offering, not just a job, but a legacy, a platform to shape how resources flowed to struggling communities long after Robert and Elena were gone. It was terrifying and humbling and exciting all at once. What about Maya? He asked suddenly. She's your granddaughter. Doesn't she inherit this? Robert smiled sadly. Maya will inherit our personal wealth, which is substantial, but the foundation is separate, governed by a board of directors. We want someone running it who understands its mission at a cellular level. Blood doesn't qualify you. character does. The promotion came with a significant raise, $75,000 a year, enough that James could afford to move Henry to a better school district, could save for college, could breathe without constantly calculating whether they could afford small indulgences. But more than the money, it came with responsibility that both excited and scared him. He was being entrusted with the financial power to change lives at scale, and the knowledge of how easily that power could be misused or wasted kept him awake some night. His first major decision as associate director was controversial. James proposed that the foundation hire 5 more people exactly like him, individuals with lived experience of poverty, trauma, or systemic marginalization, regardless of their formal education. I want formerly incarcerated people, former addicts in recovery, people who've experienced homelessness, he told the board in his first presentation, not as token representatives, but as full staff with real decision-making power. Our blind spots are killing our effectiveness. We need perspectives we're currently missing. Some board members resisted. Are we a social service agency or a professional foundation? One asked pointedly. James didn't blink. We're a foundation trying to solve problems we don't fully understand because we've never lived them. Would you hire someone to design a building who'd never been inside one? Then why are we designing poverty interventions with a staff that's never been poor? The argument was persuasive enough that the board approved a pilot program, and within 3 months, the foundation had hired 4 new community outreach specialists who transformed how they operate. Marcus, who'd been homeless for 3 years before getting housed, identified gaps in shelter services that credentialed social workers had completely missed. Teresa, a former addict with 15 years of sobriety, redesigned their substance abuse funding priorities based on what actually helped versus what sounded good in grant applications. David, who'd done 7 years in prison for a crime he committed at 19, brought insights about re-entry barriers that led to a whole new initiative around supporting formerly incarcerated people building legitimate. The work was messy and emotional and sometimes frustrating, but it was real in a way James had never experienced in construction. He was building something more permanent than houses. He was building pathways out of poverty for people who'd been told they were problems rather than human beings with potential. And the foundation Elena and Robert had spent 40 years creating was becoming something even more powerful under James's influence. Not just a source of funding, but a genuine force for systemic change. One evening, working late while Henry did homework, in the office break room, James got a call from the diner owner where Maria worked. James, you need to come down here. Something's happened. The urgency in her voice triggered immediate panic. Had Maria been hurt? Was someone in danger? He grabbed Henry and drove to the diner, his mind spinning through worst-case scenario. But when he arrived, he found celebration, not crisis. Maria stood behind the counter, surrounded by staff and regular customers, holding an envelope and crying. She saw James and rushed over. I got accepted. Portland State University. Their returning student program for people over 50. She grabbed his hands. I can finally finish my degree. And they're offering financial aid that actually covers everything. James hugged her, genuinely thrilled. Maria, that's incredible. What changed your mind? Last month you said you were too old to go back to school. She pulled back, her eyes shining. You did. Watching you take that job with the foundation, even though you were scared. Seeing you help people like me. It made me think maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe I could still become who I wanted to be before life got. She pressed the envelope to her chest. I want to be a social worker. I want to help families like mine, like yours was. And it all started because you shared a sandwich, little girl. Look what you started. Look at all of us changing our lives because you showed us change was possible. Driving home that night, Henry asked a question that stopped James cold. Dad, do you think Mom knows what you're doing? Like, wherever she is? James pulled over, unable to drive through the sudden tears. He thought about Michelle, about the woman who'd taught him that kindness was never wasted, that seeing people's humanity was the most important work anyone could do. Yeah, buddy, he managed to say. I think she knows. And I think she's proud of both of us. 3 years into his work with the Martinez Foundation, James stood at a crossroads he never could have imagined from that park bench where everything changed. Robert's health was declining, a cancer diagnosis that came with treatments that might buy time, but wouldn't cure him. The transition plan they'd carefully constructed was accelerating out of necessity, and James found himself taking on responsibilities he still sometimes felt unprepared for, despite Elena and Robert's patient mentoring. The foundation's annual gala was approaching, a fundraising event that would bring together Portland's wealthiest donors, nonprofit leaders, and community stakeholders. Traditionally, Robert gave the keynote address, but this year, he asked James to do it. I'll be there, Robert said, his voice weaker than it had been even a month ago. But I want them to hear from you, to understand the vision you're bringing to this work. You're not just continuing what Elena and I started, you're transforming it into something better, Writing the speech was torture. James sat at his desk overlooking the Willamette River, drafting and deleting, trying to find words adequate to express what the past 3 years had meant. How do you explain to a room full of wealthy people that the most important thing you'd learned was that their money meant nothing without genuine relationship? That writing checks was easy, but seeing people as fully human when society told you they were disposable, that was the real work? Henry found him late one, still struggling. Draft. His son was 11 now, growing into the kind of young man Michelle would have loved. Thoughtful, kind, observant. Just tell them the truth, Dad, Henry said with the simple wisdom children sometimes possess. Tell them about Maya and the sandwich. Tell them why it mattered. James looked at his son, at this boy who'd watched his father nearly break under the weight of grief and poverty, and had somehow remained sweet and compassionate through all of it, and knew exactly what to say. The night of the gala, James wore a suit that actually fit properly, something Elena had insisted the foundation budget for, and stood backstage feeling like an imposter. Through the curtain, he could see 300 people in evening wear, sipping wine that cost more per glass than he used to spend on groceries for a week. These were the people with power and resources, the ones who could change everything if they chose to see what needed changing. Elena found him in the wings, took his shaking hands in hers. You belong here, not because you clean up well, or because we gave you a title, but because you understand something most people in that room never would. That every single person has inherent worth regardless of their bank account or circumstances. They need to hear that. Be brave. When he walked onto the stage, the applause was polite, curious. They knew his story in general terms. The Martinez Foundation's promotional materials featured him prominently, but he was still the construction worker turned non-profit director, an interesting novelty. James stood at the podium, looked out at the sea of expensive jewelry and designer clothes, and began with the truth. 3 years ago, I gave away a sandwich and $20 I couldn't afford to a little girl and her grandmother in a park. It was the easiest and hardest decision I'd made in a long time. Easy because my wife had taught me that you help people when you see their suffering. Hard because I was barely surviving myself, and giving away resources felt dangerous when I had so little. He paused, letting the silence settle. That little girl was Maya Martinez, and her grandparents are Robert and Elena Martinez, whose foundation you're supporting. He saw recognition ripple through the crowd, people making connections they hadn't previously understood. I want to tell you what happened after I gave away that sandwich. I went home and ate rice and beans for a while. My son and I were hungry. We were scared, but we were also at peace because we'd done the right thing, even when it cost us everything. His voice strengthened, and then something I didn't expect happened. Robert and Elena found me. They gave me a job, cleared my debts, and changed my entire life. But more than that, they taught me something about wealth that I think people with money often miss. James looked directly at the audience, no longer intimidated by their status or resources. You all have the power to change lives. The question isn't whether you have enough money. You clearly do, or you wouldn't be here paying $200 for a plate of salmon. The question is whether you're willing to see the people who need help as whole human beings worthy of dignity, or whether you see them as problems to be solved from a comfortable distance. The room had gone completely silent. The Martinez Foundation used to fund programs the same way most foundations do. Find established organizations, write checks, measure outcomes with statistics. It's clean and professional and doesn't require you to get uncomfortable. But it doesn't change much because it doesn't address why people are struggling in the first place. Since I've been here, we've changed our approach. We fund people, not just programs. We build relationships, not just budgets. We ask communities what they need instead of telling them what we think they need. And it's messy and hard, and sometimes we fail. But when we succeed, we actually transform lives. James shared stories then. Maria going back to school, the veteran who now counseled others, the single mom who became a nurse, Marcus and Teresa and David and the dozens of others whose lives had changed because someone saw them as capable rather than broken. Every single one of these people had potential that society was wasting because we'd decided their circumstances defined their worth. All they needed was someone to believe in them, provide resources with dignity attached. He was reaching his conclusion now, could feel the emotional weight building. Robert is dying. It's not a secret. Cancer doesn't negotiate. But before he goes, he and Elena are entrusting me with this foundation's future. Me, a construction worker who barely finished community college, who was on food stamps 3 years ago, who gave away a sandwich because my dead wife's voice in my head told me it was the right thing to do. His voice cracked slightly. They're giving me this responsibility because they believe that people who've experienced poverty and survived with their compassion intact are exactly who should be distributing resources to others in need. James looked up at the chandelier-lit ceiling, gathering himself. I'm asking you tonight not just for money, though we need that. I'm asking you to see people differently. When you walk past someone struggling, I want you to remember that they're not there because they're lazy or broken. They're there because our systems are designed to punish poverty rather than alleviate. And I want you to remember that you, yes, you with your comfortable life and disposable income, you have the power to change that for specific human beings with names and stories and potential. He ended with Maya. A little girl sat on a swing 3 years ago, hungry and scared, wondering if anyone would notice she existed. A construction worker with his own problems decided she mattered enough to sacrifice his own meal for. That choice set in motion everything you see tonight. This event, this foundation's evolution, the 147 families we've helped in the past year alone. One sandwich, $20, and the courage to see someone as worthy of help, even when helping was inconvenient. James stepped back from the podium. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting this work. And please, go forth from this evening committed to seeing people, really seeing them, because that's where change begins. Not in bank accounts, but in the moment you decide another person's suffering matters as much as your own comfort. The applause started slowly, then built to something that felt like thunder. People stood, and James saw tears on faces throughout the crowd. Elena was openly crying in the front row, and Robert beside her looked proud despite his evident exhaustion. But the real validation came later, during the reception, when donor after donor approached James, stories of their own, moments they'd walked past need, times they'd given grudgingly, and newly formed commitments to do better. One woman, dripping in diamonds James could have lived on for a year, grabbed his hand fiercely. My grandmother was Maya. 70 years ago, during the Depression, someone gave her food when she was starving. She never forgot it. She told me that story until she died, and I never really understood why it mattered so much to her. Now I do. Thank you for reminding me. My family came from before we had money. Robert Martinez died 4 months after the gala, peacefully in his sleep with Elena beside him. The funeral was massive, a testament to the lives he'd touched, the communities he'd served, the legacy he was leaving. James gave one of the eulogies, standing before hundreds of mourners and trying to express what this man had meant to him personally, and to countless others who'd benefited from his generosity. Robert taught me that wealth without compassion is poverty of a different kind, James said, his voice steady despite the grief crushing his chest. He had every material thing anyone could want, but what he valued most was connection, dignity, and the belief that every person deserved a chance to thrive. He saw that potential in when I was at my lowest, and he gave me not just a job, but purpose. I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor that gift by extending it to others. After the service, Elena pulled James aside. She'd aged, visibly in the months of Robert's decline, but her eyes were still sharp, still kind. He was so proud of you. Did you know that? He'd tell anyone who'd listen about the man who gave away his last sandwich, and turned out to be exactly who we needed to carry this forward. She handed him a letter, Robert's handwriting shaky but legible. He wanted you to have this. Read it when you're ready. James waited until he was home, Henry asleep, before opening the envelope. Robert's letter was brief, but devastating. James, by the time you read this I'll be gone. I'm not afraid. I've lived fully, loved deeply, and did my best to leave the world better than I found it. Now that work belongs to you, the foundation is yours to lead. Elena will remain as chairman of the board as long as she's able. But the vision, the direction, the soul of this organization, that's yours now. Don't be safe. Don't do what's comfortable. Do what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. You know what suffering looks like. You know what it costs to choose generosity over self-preservation. That knowledge is precious. Use it. Change lives. Make me proud. Robert James folded the letter carefully, his tears falling freely now, and made a promise to a dead man that he'd do exactly. The next 5 years saw the Martinez Foundation grow and transform under James's leadership in ways that attracted national attention. He launched the Lived Experience Initiative, requiring that at least 40% of staff and board members have direct experience with the issues the foundation addressed: poverty, homelessness, incarceration, addiction, domestic violence. The approach was controversial in nonprofit circles, but the results were undeniable. Programs became more effective, relationships with communities deepened, and trust, that elusive currency that money couldn't buy, flourished. James became a sought-after speaker at philanthropy conferences, pushing back against traditional approaches that treated poor people as problems requiring expert solutions, rather than as experts on their own lives requiring resources and respect. He wrote a book with a title that made publishers nervous but resonated with readers: The Sandwich Principle: Why Real Change Requires Uncomfortable Generosity. It became a surprise bestseller, spawning a movement of foundations rethinking how they approach their work. But the most meaningful changes happened at the individual level, in stories that never made headlines. The teenager aging out of foster care who got not just housing assistance, but genuine mentorship from someone who'd experienced the system's failure. The immigrant family navigating bureaucracy, who found not just financial support but translation service and legal advocacy. The disabled veteran, who received not just a check, but connections to employment designed around his capabilities rather than his limitations. Maya, now a teenager, became one of James's most effective advocates. She spoke at fundraisers about what it meant to be seen in your worst moment by someone who had every reason to look away, how that one interaction had given her the security to believe the world wasn't entirely cruel. She and Henry had become close over the years. Not quite siblings, but something like cousins, bonded by the shared experience of losing mothers too young and being raised by people determined to honor those losses through kindness. Elena lived to see the Foundation's 15th anniversary under James's full leadership. She was 91, increasingly frail, but her mind remained sharp until, at the anniversary gala, she insisted on saying a few words. James helped her to the stage, her hand trembling in his. "When Robert and I found James 8 years ago," she said, her voice soft but carrying through the microphone, "we thought we were repaying a debt. We thought we were thanking someone for helping us, but we were actually finding the person who would carry our life's work into the future with more wisdom and compassion than we ever brought to it." She turned to James, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You took a sandwich and $20 and turned it into a legacy that will outlive all of us. You took your pain and transformed it into purpose. You took being seen in your own moment of desperation and made it your life's mission to see others. That's alchemy, James. That's grace. Robert and I couldn't be prouder if you were our own son." Elena died 3 months later, peacefully in her sleep, and James delivered another eulogy, this time for the woman who'd seen worth in him when he couldn't see it in himself. At her funeral, he announced the creation of the Elena Martinez Dignity in Giving Award, to be given annually to individuals who demonstrated extraordinary compassion while facing their own hardship. The first recipient was obvious: Maria, the diner manager who'd gone back to school and was now a licensed social worker, running a program helping older adults access education. She accepted the award with the same grace she'd shown that night James first met her, overwhelmed but determined to pay forward what she'd received. Now, 10 years after that day in the park, James sat in the Foundation's boardroom, leading a meeting about next year's strategic priorities. Around the table were faces representing every kind of struggle: poverty, racism, addiction, violence, loss. But more than that, they represented survival, resilience, transformation. These were people who'd been written off by society and had proven everyone wrong. They were the heart of everything the Foundation did. After the meeting, James stood at his window overlooking the city, thinking about trajectories and choices and the strange mathematics of generosity. One sandwich, one moment of choosing to see another person's suffering as more important than his own needs. That single choice had unlocked a door he hadn't known existed, leading to a life of meaning and impact he couldn't have imagined. In his darkest hours after Michelle's death, his phone buzzed. Henry, now 17 and preparing for college, texting a photo from his volunteer shift at a homeless shelter. "This is what I want to do with my life. Help people like you taught me." James smiled, his eyes burning with proud tears, the ripples spreading wider still, touching lives he'd never meet, carried forward by a new generation. Learning that character was defined by what you did when you had every excuse not to. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs reminding that small acts of kindness create massive ripples. We all have sandwiches to give, moments where we choose compassion over convenience, connection over comfort. Those choices matter more than we can measure. They change individual lives, and sometimes, if we're paying attention, they change our own lives in the process. Be the person who sees. Be the person who gives even when it's hard. That's how we build a better world. One sandwich, one moment, one choice.